Christ offered himself on the altar of the cross, not to the devil, but to the triune God. And he did so for all, with regard to the sufficiency of the price, but only for the elect, with regard to its efficacy, because he secured salvation only for the predestined. We know over the last couple of weeks in our Elder's Voice videos, we've been addressing our high point distinctives. And today, we're continuing this series, especially in the doctrines of grace, otherwise known as the 5 points of Calvinism, using the well-known acronym TULIP. A TULIP, of course, represents the doctrines of total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and the perseverance of the saints. Today we're looking at the L, limited atonement. And if there was any of those doctrines, perhaps even more than the doctrine of unconditional election, that sort of makes the hair on the back of most evangelicals' heads stand up, it is the doctrine of limited atonement. It answers the question, for whom did Christ die? Did Christ die for the sins of the whole world? Or did he die only for the elect? And there's a sense in which that it's a good thing that Christians are so concerned about this doctrine, because we understand how important it is that we get it right. We don't want to limit, interestingly, Christ's atoning work as it's explained for us in Scripture. And for that reason, historically speaking, it's a little bit misleading to speak of limited atonement. That wasn't a term that the Reformers preferred to use, or even modern Reformed Christians who affirm the doctrine of limited atonement. That was a term that was used by Jacob Arminius. You remember him. He was the one who taught these points of distinction, how his own convictions differed from John Calvin, to his students, who would become known as the Remonstrants. Otherwise, those who affirm limited atonement to this day prefer the term particular redemption, because that more accurately conveys what we're talking about when we answer the question, for whom did Christ die? Because whichever side of the fence that you might be on, whether you believe in a so-called unlimited atonement or a so-called limited atonement, you have to limit the atonement one way or another. Otherwise, you are a universalist. Now that goes back to the quote that I shared with you from the beginning. We said that John Calvin was not the originator of these 5 points of Calvinism, the doctrines of grace. He didn't introduce them to the church by any means. In fact, there is probably no man who influenced John Calvin more than Augustine, going all the way back to the 5th century. But the quote that I gave to you was from a man named Peter Lombard in the 12th century, from a systematic theology that he wrote. It was basically a systematic theology called the Sentences. At a time, that book was required. It was considered to be essential reading for any serious theological student. And because of that, there was perhaps no book that influenced John Calvin or Martin Luther any more than Lombard's Sentences. And in that work, interestingly enough, about 90% of it comes from Augustine, and appropriately so, because when we're talking about defending the doctrines of grace, who better to go to than Augustine, who upheld and thought well about the doctrines of grace because of the onslaught of a man named Pelagius. We've talked about him before. And Pelagianism was condemned at the Council of Ephesus in the 5th century, and again at the Council of Orange in the 6th century. But nevertheless, Pelagianism continued to spread, and that's what motivated Lombard himself to also defend the doctrine of the atonement, the atoning work of Jesus Christ. And that last phrase is so very helpful, in which he explains his rationale for why we have to affirm the fact that Christ died to pay the penalty for the sins only for the elect with regard to its efficacy, because we know that it is only the predestined, the saved, who are actually saved. If Christ died efficaciously for all mankind, then you can only be a universalist because of what Christ's atoning work actually is. Now, the word atonement, the primary word for atonement in the Old Testament, is the Hebrew word kafar. And that word means to atone for, it means to redeem, it means to cleanse. And if you look the word up in any lexicon or a theological dictionary, it'll tell you that. So if we're talking about cleansing, or we're talking about redemption, or we're even talking about the forgiveness of sins, which is also an appropriate way to translate that word kafar, then it begins to clarify the issue at hand. Are we really going to say that Christ, in his death, which secures the forgiveness of sins and the cleansing of sin to all men universally, are we going to say that he paid the penalty for sin universally for all individuals in the world? Well, if we do, then what is the reason that men will pay the penalty for their sin in eternal punishment if Christ has already paid for those sins? Well, that's absurd to think of Christ's work in that context. And that's why I said, even if you believe in so-called an unlimited atonement, if you affirm that, you have to, therefore, limit the atonement in its efficacy, to use that word that Peter Lombard did. In other words, in its power. It was not sufficient to secure an actual cleansing, to secure an actual forgiveness of sin, but only a potential one. And that's a dangerous doctrine and leads to the Pelagianism and semi-Pelagianism of Roman Catholicism to this day. But if you believe in limited atonement, or like I said, better to call it particular redemption, then what you're saying is that Christ's atoning work is unlimited in its effect, though it's limited in its extent. In other words, Christ's atoning work is work in which he redeemed sinners from their sin. He paid the penalty for our sin. That is only applied to the predestined of God, those who are saved from their sin. You might be wondering, well, what about the all passages? What about John 3:16? For God so loved the world that he sent his son. What about 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 3 and 4 and even 5? God desires all men to be saved and come to a saving knowledge of the truth. Well, interestingly enough, we could take a look at what Aquinas has to say about that about 100 years after Peter Lombard. And he made a good point, first of which, with respect to the all passages. One, we know that whatever God wills to accomplish, he has within his power to accomplish it. What he will to accomplish, he will accomplish. And secondly, none come to him for salvation unless he wills. John 6:44. No one comes to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. And third, therefore, we must understand passages that talk about all, or the world, in its appropriate context. See, what a lot of believers do is they kind of just lob these verses back and forth, like John 3:16, or passages like in 1 Timothy 2, that Christ died for all the world, as a proof text, as an insincere argument at best, an unauthentic way of trying to move the ball further down the field, but it really does no such thing. It's not a helpful or an honest discussion about the issue. Because really, when we understand those verses in context and don't use them as proof texts, and we understand that what they're saying is that Christ died to pay the penalty for the sins of the world, yes, we can say that. But not all mankind universally in an individualistic way. Again, otherwise we're universalists. Everybody's already saved. So why bother evangelizing? Why bother warning unbelievers of the wrath to come? But rather, the world is in reference to all people without regard to their background, their ethnicity. Christ died for the human race. That's it. Whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, Christ's atoning work was efficacious to save all who would believe, to secure the sins of those to secure the forgiveness of sins that Christ died for, past, present, and future. And that's why Hebrews 9 and 10 especially talks about the efficacious nature of Christ's death, the sufficient, the all-powerful nature of Christ's death. Whereas in the Old Testament, the blood of bulls and goats could not take away sins, but rather they had to keep continually sacrificing them as they looked forward to the atoning work of Jesus Christ. But rather, Christ's death granted the forgiveness of sins for those who believe, past, present, and future. And that is in part why that those whom Christ has saved, those for whom his atoning work is applied, they are also eternally secure. So hopefully that helps in the discussion a little bit, in your understanding of the doctrine of limited atonement. It's really not limited unless you limit it with regard to its extent or its efficacy. One or the other has to be true, or you're a universalist. I'm a whole lot more comfortable limiting the power of Christ's work in regard to its extent than its effect, because I know that when we apply Christ's redemptive work to those who place their faith and trust in Jesus Christ, they have been cleansed from all unrighteousness. So it is absolutely effectual for the predestined of God.